Hello and welcome back to another episode of Strong Collectors Comics. My name is Jordan and I'm joined today as ever by my plucky co-host Dakota. And today we're going to be showing a little bit of love to the early 2000s era of Marvel Comics. Now, I feel like there is some respect and dues this era gets given. I feel like traditionally Dakota, the golden age of comics, especially Marvel, always thought of as like the early stuff. Maybe you go to the 60s. I think a lot of it's in the 80s and 90s. You got
Hmm.
Secret Wars, the X-Men, all that, Dark Phoenix stuff, all that. And that's all very cool. However, I think when we were coming up in comic books, there was a lot of cool stuff going on. At least for me, as we read a couple different series. I mean, I think we both love the through line that you had, starting with, I'd say loosely, Avengers Disassembled, moving into, we had House of M, we had Civil War, we had Secret Invasion, we had Dark Reign, we had Siege. And I remember like following all of that in real time as it happened, which that spanned several years. But that
Yeah.
was a very cool, sprawling story that I think kept evolving and kind of leading one into the other. And a lot of this was prompted by us looking at some old adverts for those events, whether it was like the Dark Reign promos, the Civil War promos, the Secret Invasion promos. And I do feel like that is kind of something to me that's lacking in the modern era, is like the events feeling big and important, and that they were kind of building on each other and working together.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think I appreciated the promos as much when I was reading the comics, but
Mm-hmm.
looking back now, I'm like, there really isn't that type of build up for anything. Like I know just recently they did the whole blood hunt stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like current comics are kind of along the lines of like it's just not gonna matter. But
Mm-hmm.
back when you were reading from, like you said, disassembled to even, I would say, through Avengers versus X-Men, it's like the things that were
Yeah.
happening in these events
Mm-hmm.
were happening, and it really shaped the entire universe of Marvel.
Yeah, I think the Blood Hunt thing is a good example because, like, a lot of these events to me feel they're sort of just like flash in the pan. They just happen. It's like, okay, they're going to fight vampires. And I know next year is this God Emperor Doom again. Doom takes over the whatever. And it's like, I guess I get it, but naturally I don't get it. That's a lie. But it's just like, I think you had this sense of, yeah, like you said, things kind of, there was excitement for it. I think it felt like these really mattered. Like I haven't felt for quite a while, like, why do I really need to read this big event? Like, what's important about it? Or what is there to really pull me in? Or like, what are the lasting consequences going to be? And maybe that's what we liked about those, that era, that run, was like things were building on each other and they felt like they were significant. Like when you had Civil War, like that was a big thing, that like, okay, the superheroes are
Hmm.
divided now, and there's the Registration Act. I remember as a kid reading that and like, man, this is pretty intense. Like this is a big deal. And then of course we both love Dark Reign and like what that meant for having a good chunk of time where it's like the bad guys kind of win and like the heroes are on the run and like what are they gonna do? And it wasn't just like, okay, business as usual right away. I mean,
Hmm.
eventually you
Right.
kind of move back to that, but I think they were willing to sit in like an unexplored era or like new territory that maybe is was a little bit risky because it was different than what has come before.
Yeah, and I think it was such, like, I don't think we thought about it, or maybe some people did, but I didn't think about it at the time, or even as I would go back and reread those books. But it is such a good and almost natural progression of, you have Civil War where the heroes are kind of against each other.
Mm-hmm.
There's still that like supervillain conflict in there, but the main conflict is between the heroes, which then
Mm-hmm.
makes sense to then follow it up with, not long after that, is Dark Reign,
Mm-hmm.
where the villains kind of had their time to be like, let the heroes do their thing, tire each
Or you
other
had
out.
Secret Invasion that kind of hit at a time where they were divided, if I remember right. And
Right.
then,
Yeah.
yeah, and then like that kind of hit at a perfect time where it's like, I do think that was the missed MCU opportunity, as we've talked about, was to do Civil War and
Hmm.
then have the Secret Invasion happen, right? Because then it's like, maybe if we were all working together, we could have a better handle on this. And then, yeah, Norman
Hmm.
Osborn like seizing power in that to put himself in a position was just such a cool arc Like,
Yeah.
and it made sense as you look at it, but it was new as it was like unfolding, and then culminating with Siege, I thought was so cool.
Hmm.
Um, how they did that.
Yeah. And I can see somewhat the argument, like if the MCU just thought maybe the fans wouldn't be able to handle a long drawn out civil war where it's like, why are the superheroes fighting each other? But I do think that the fans would have still enjoyed that.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it should have been maybe not quite its whole, like a whole like Infinity Saga was, but it still could have been at
Hmm.
least the span over 3 years. I think could have been enough to give us several
Yeah.
movies, and then that leads into
Hmm.
kind of these bigger events
Yeah.
versus just having like, oh, Civil War is one single Captain America movie and then it's over.
Yeah. Well,
Eh,
and like, yeah, I think people want the events or the big stories to have consequences. Like you said, Civil War, Secret Invasion, whatever. Like this kind of set like the tone for the whole world. Whereas to
mhm.
me, like a Blood Hunt, it's like I'm pretty sure they fight the vampires and then they beat the vampires and then that's kind of it, and we move on. And it's like, well,
Right.
what was the point of all that? It's like,
And I don't think you were ever going to sell that story as like, hey, vampires are going to be the big thing. Some of these heroes are going to get turned into vampires. And nobody ever picked up issue number one saying, oh man, if they might just turn the X Men all into vampires forever. Like you
right.
knew going into this that sure, this is a vampire story, but the vampires are going to be
Hmm.
beaten at the end. Back in the day, they
Hmm.
had Jubilee was a vampire for quite a while, but still, it's
Right.
like that's even been reversed since then. So
Hmm.
it's just is one of those like very low stakes. Just it just seems like a summer money grab. Nothing
Yeah.
really that important.
Right. So if we have like the big, I guess I'll throw maybe this one was the summer event, World War Hulk. I'll throw World War
Yeah.
Hulk in there too.
Oh
That was a
yeah.
little bit of a side journey in this whole thing, but I remember that being really cool and being excited. Of course, you read the Planet Hulk, which then set that up.
Hmm.
And then I guess now we're moving. So outside of like the main thread of narrative, Dakota, what are your like standouts from this early 2000s era that maybe doesn't get as much recognition as
I
it
mean,
probably should?
it's not a part of that like kind of cornerstone that you'd mentioned, but one of my all-time favorites is Astonishing X-Men.
Hmm. Oh
Um,
yeah.
that was during that time. You
Hmm.
also had Young Avengers came up. That was when they
Hmm.
first came onto the scene. Irredeemable Ant-Man was, I think, maybe one of
Hmm.
my hidden gems from
Yeah,
that
that was
episode.
a good one.
You even had the start of the Ultimate Universe, so you had Ultimate
Oh, for
Spider-Man,
sure.
which is fantastic.
Hmm.
And the Ultimates. I think we've said
Yeah,
the Ultimates kind of falls off around 3,
I've
but I think 1 and 2
yeah
are really good.
yeah I've heard a lot of kind of retroactive hate for like the Ultimate Universe, like it's being too
Hmm,
dark and edgy and gritty or whatever. And there's maybe some elements where it went too far, as we definitely
sure.
saw with Ultimates 3. But I think overall, both Spider-Man, I'd say definitely the Ultimates, and a lot of the X-Men stuff was kind of necessary to like give you a bit of a
Mhm.
reinterpretation on these characters, and I think is responsible for kind of giving Marvel that boost that let them keep going, and then eventually
Yeah,
set up a lot of the MCU stuff that they
for
pulled from
sure.
for that.
And it's not like I I don't think I will see what happens with the Absolute Universe that just started with DC,
Hmm.
but I'm gonna highly suspect that it's gonna be nowhere near as long running as something like Ultimate Spider-Man, which was I think
Yeah.
150-ish issues.
Hmm.
So that spans several years. That might even go outside of our 2000 to 2010. It might be
Yeah.
just within that, but still, that's a lot
Hmm.
of issues to have kept a book going. Same with like just that whole Ultimates universe. I think it kind of maybe got a little hard to at the very end. Maybe not as good as it was at the beginning, but that's still a long time
Hmm.
to stick with kind of that alternate reality that then
Right.
gets folded into the main reality. It's not just something where it was like, oh, hey, here's a 10 issue series, and then
Hmm.
it's either part of this or it's just thrown away.
Hmm.
So I think just even that alone is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even in the main, I mean, I think everybody pretty much loves, but I always really liked the Straczynski Spider-Man stuff in that
Yep.
era, where you kind of
Hmm.
had you had Moreland showing up, you had him, dealing with Aunt May, finding out his secret identity, like becoming a teacher. Like it was actually a cool progression of that character, even in like the main uh, thread of the timeline, I guess, which I think doesn't really happen so much. But then you also had Straczynski's Thor stuff. I mean, that stuff was so cool. If anybody hasn't read that, the like run after, because they did the Ragnarok where like the gods got wiped out and then Thor's kind of reborn and he's in Oklahoma and all that stuff, and there's some really cool stuff there. So yeah, I mean, I think all around there are a lot of great, like if we think of pre 2000 was like the best era of Marvel Comics, I think there's a lot of cool foundational stuff. But I think
Mhm.
in that time period, a lot of good creators came along and like expanded. Oh, I mean, the Daredevil, like the Bendis
Right.
stuff, the Brubaker
Yeah.
stuff, Mark Miller's Wolverine, Enemy of the State, I think is a great Wolverine story. So it's
You
like
had Old Man Logan in there too.
Old Man, yeah, that's true. Old Man Logan was in there, and so yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that era took cool pieces that have been set up, and then we're doing new things or like finding ways to kind of have fresh takes on these characters. I will say after Siege culminated, I kind of did fall off a little bit as far as following like the main universe. I remember reading
Mhm.
Avengers X-Men. I remember Fear Itself, Secret Wars. Um, but I mean,
Yeah.
definitely, I think that is about as far as I was as like consistently I'm sticking with stuff.
Mhm. I
But
mean, I
I
think
thought,
I
yeah.
I went a little bit farther. Like I still read the Avengers versus X-Men, which I thought was really good. And I'll
Hmm.
admit that maybe as you go on, it maybe teeters off just a little bit, but I still really
Yeah.
liked at least the X-Men stuff with, like I said,
Hmm.
Avengers versus X-Men, and then especially like the Uncanny X-Men into the
Hmm.
all new X-Men. That timeline was some of
Yeah.
my favorite X-Men stories.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I
yeah.
think I'm realizing as you're talking about, there's a lot of like consistent creators they used that I think
Mhm.
you would have had maybe even like in dialogue with each other, whether it was Bendis or Miller or like Brubaker, like guys that were kind of working together. I think Jonathan Hickman kind of came in on the tail end of that, and
Mhm.
he's kind of their guy now. But I don't know how many like powerhouse writers, more or less, they have today, that are like
Right.
making big stuff happen and like, oh, I gotta read it. If this guy writes it for Marvel, like I gotta check it out.
Mhm.
Um, I feel like that has maybe gone away a little bit, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think even so like we've only been talking about Marvel during this whole time, but I would even
Yeah.
say like even just to give you some more like solidifying factors that 2000 to 2010 was the best.
Hmm.
For DC, you've got Hush, Blackest Night, Brightest Day,
Yeah.
Superman Red Son, the
Hmm.
JLA Avengers was during that time, All-Star
Hmm.
Superman, the Batman and
Yeah.
Son, Batman and Robin, where uh,
Right.
you've got uh, like Bruce Wayne was, not dead, but gets replaced with Dick
Caveman.
Grayson. Yeah. So I know that's not your favorite.
No.
And then
Yeah.
outside of Marvel and DC, you had Invincible started during, I think that was 2003 or 4 maybe. That's my favorite
Hmm.
like all-time story. And maybe not the best comics ever, but The Walking Dead
Hmm.
started, The Boys, Sweet Tooth.
Yeah.
So very very important era. And I would
I
I
would
would
say.
still
Yeah.
say the most important. Well, most important, like a lot of these characters were created earlier, but this was the
Hmm.
best era of storytelling, in my opinion.
Ooh, hot take. I like it. That
I'm
should be the
I'm
title.
I'm saying it. I'm saying it.
Yes.
'Cause I mean,
So
like,
those,
and again,
yeah.
I'm not the best to talk about that because, I don't it's hard for me to read an old comic. Like, you're not gonna find me going back
Hmm.
to I did read that first appearance of the Joker. That was pretty good. I will give that
Hmm.
one credit. But
Right.
to be able to sit down and read 100
Well,
issues of
yeah.
any story from even the '80s is pretty challenging for me.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to sit down to read like the first few Fantastic Fours, and it's like, I hope there's nobody out there who is like, these are me. Like, yes, it was important for the time, but it's like these are
Mhm.
these are pretty rough if you're looking at them from modern standards. I mean, there's a lot of cool
Yeah.
things there. I think that gets better as time progresses. I could see where in the 70s and 80s you started to get more of like progression in storytelling. I think the X-Men
Mhm.
80s stuff still holds up pretty well. I think that's probably some of the best,
Sure.
like Days of Future Past, Dark Phoenix, some of that. Um, but yeah, I guess it felt like the era we're talking about was more focused. I feel like it was pretty
Yeah.
focused. I think it was story driven. I think there are frills, there's side tangents, but I think it all felt like a lot of this stuff matters and is important. And we're really kind of developing these characters and
Mhm.
building into things that are
Yeah.
bigger than just here's a couple books. Wasn't that fun? It's like, no, this is like
Mhm.
something bigger. And I think that is what's kind of missing for sure in Marvel, maybe in some other mediums too for comics, but like that the importance of the events and why you want to keep reading and why you want to keep coming back to these characters in this world. Those are some of our thoughts on that early 2000s era of Marvel that we have a very soft spot for. Hopefully you do as well. If not, you can go back and check out some of those books we've been talking about. Let us know in the comments below what you like of that era of Marvel Comics. Maybe what era is your favorite. If Dakota's totally off his rocker for saying that that's the best era of Marvel Comics, but I think he's got something there. So please be liking, sharing, and subscribing. And until next time, as always, stay strong.